Variables and constructs are two words students hear constantly, and they are often used as if they mean the same thing. They do not. Understanding the difference matters because it affects how you read the literature, how you write research questions, and how you design a study that actually examines what it claims to examine. Determining variables and constructs is the final conceptual step before you move into methods, so getting this clear now prevents confusion later. A variable is something that can vary and be measured. In quantitative research, variables are the elements you can count, score, compare, or analyze. They show up as numbers, categories, scales, or coded values. A variable is something that can vary and be measured. In quantitative research, variables are the elements you can count, score, compare, or analyze. They show up as numbers, categories, scales, or coded values. If you can assign it a value and that value can differ across people, groups, time, or conditions, it functions as a variable. A construct is a concept. It is the larger idea you are trying to understand that cannot be directly observed in a single, simple way. Constructs are things like anxiety, engagement, independence, belonging, motivation, or quality of life. You cannot measure a construct itself. Instead, you define what the construct means in your study, and then decide how it will be represented through evidence. This relationship is foundational. Constructs live at the meaning level. A variable is something that can vary and be measured. In quantitative research, variables are the elements you can count, score, compare, or analyze. They show up as numbers, categories, scales, or coded values. If you can assign it a value and that value can differ across people, groups, time, or conditions, it functions as a variable. Variables live at the measurement level. Constructs are what you care about. Variables are how you gather evidence about them. Here is a simple example. If your construct is engagement, you still have to define what engagement means in your context. Does it mean participation in discussion? After you research, you define the constructs for engagement as time on task and persistence through difficulty. You cite the articles that have defined the concept of engagement as time on task or persistence through difficulty. Once you define the constructs for engagement within a discussion, you can identify variables that represent and can measure it. How can you measure time on task? It could be number of posts, minutes actively working, task completion rates, or even survey scores related to attention or interest in discussion topics. How you measure it is up to you as long as it aligns with your methods, the phenomenon, tension and consequence, etc. A common mistake is treating a construct as if it were already a variable. Saying, "I will measure independence," without defining what independence means or how it will be observed skips a critical step. Independence is not a variable on its own. It becomes measurable only after you specify what counts as independence in your study, and how it will be represented. Here is what that looks like when it is done well. If the construct is independence for learners with autism and dyslexia, you define it first based on the literature you have read. Independence might mean initiating tasks without prompts, completing work without human mediation, or regulating emotions during complex tasks. Once defined, you can identify variables that measure the constructs such as frequency of prompts, level of support required, time to task initiation, observed strategy use, or self-reported confidence. Independence remains the construct. Those indicators are the variables. Another mistake is circular measurement. For example, saying, "I will measure quality of life by asking participants if they have a good quality of life." That does not clarify the construct or how it is represented. To fix this, quality of life must be defined and then represented through variables such as perceived autonomy, stress levels, participation in meaningful activities, or satisfaction across life domains. It is also important to distinguish between constructs, variables, and instruments. These are not interchangeable. Anxiety is a construct. An anxiety score is a variable. The specific survey, scale, rubric, or observation protocol used to generate that score is the instrument. Being explicit about each one keeps your study aligned and prevents unsupported claims. Another issue to watch for is confusing what is easy to measure, which is the variable, with what you actually claim to study. Usage metrics such as number of logins, minutes in a tool, or frequency of use are variables. They can be useful, but they are not the same thing as learning, independence, or skill development. For example, a study might claim to examine the impact of an AI tool on learner independence, but then measure only how often students log in, or how long they spend using the tool. In that case, the study is not actually measuring independence. It is measuring usage. High usage does not automatically mean increased independence, just as low usage does not automatically mean a lack of growth. The variable being measured does not match the construct being claimed. To align the study, the construct has to be defined first. If independence is the construct, the study must decide what independence looks like in practice. That might include initiating tasks without prompts, completing work without human mediation, or using strategies autonomously. Variables would then be chosen to represent those behaviors, such as frequency of prompts, level of support required, or observed strategy use. Usage data might still be included, but it would support the analysis rather than stand in for the construct itself. Seeing this distinction clearly helps prevent overclaiming. Measuring what is easy instead of what is meaningful is one of the most common ways studies drift out of alignment. Being explicit about the difference between usage variables and conceptual constructs keeps the claims of the study grounded in what the data can actually support. This distinction plays out differently depending on research approach. In quantitative research, variables are central because the study is built around measuring variation and examining relationships. Constructs guide that process by shaping which variables matter and how they are operationalized. In qualitative research, the role of variables looks different. Qualitative studies are driven by constructs, concepts, or sensitizing ideas rather than by variables in the statistical sense. The focus is on meaning, process, experience, and context. Constructs guide what you ask, what you observe, and how you interpret patterns, even when you are not reducing those patterns to numbers. This is also one of the reasons qualitative research is often used earlier in a line of inquiry. When a phenomenon is new, poorly defined, or inconsistently described in the literature, it may not yet be ready to be measured well. This is an early indicator that your study should be qualitative, because researchers may not know what the construct actually looks like for participants, what dimensions it includes, or what indicators would meaningfully represent it. Qualitative work allows researchers to explore and develop the construct itself, so later studies can measure it with greater validity. Qualitative studies can still involve variables in limited ways. Variables may appear as descriptive attributes used to characterize participants or contexts, or through sampling decisions that allow comparison across experiences. The difference is that these distinctions are used to deepen interpretation, not to test statistical relationships. In mixed methods research, constructs often sit at the center while variables and qualitative data work together. Variables may identify patterns, and qualitative data then explain how participants experience and make sense of the construct behind those patterns. A useful way to check your own work is to ask this question: if you had to collect data tomorrow, what exactly would you record? If you cannot answer that clearly, you are still working at the construct level and have not identified your variables yet. That uncertainty is normal. Clarity often emerges through iteration, not in a single pass. It also helps to understand what constructs are not. Naming constructs is not the same thing as having a conceptual framework. Constructs are the building blocks. For example, you might have constructs like independence, anxiety, and scaffolding, but a framework would explain how scaffolding influences independence, how independence relates to anxiety over time, and what mechanisms connect them. The framework is the logic that organizes the constructs into an explanatory model. One final alignment point is consistency. Once you choose a definition for a construct, that definition needs to stay consistent across the study. The way you define the construct should match the way you write the purpose, the way you phrase the research questions, the way you select measures or prompts, and the way you interpret findings. When a construct is defined one way but measured another way, the study loses alignment even if the methods are technically strong. Not every concept you encounter is meant to function as a construct. A construct earns its place because it does conceptual work in a field. It appears in the literature with definitions. It helps explain patterns or outcomes. And it can be operationalized through evidence. Constructs are chosen, not invented. You are locating a concept the field already treats as meaningful and being explicit about which definition you are using and why. That choice determines which variables make sense, which instruments are appropriate, and which claims your data can support. Understanding variables and constructs is not about memorizing terminology. It is about alignment. When constructs are clear, variables align. When variables align, methods make sense. And when all three are aligned, the study you build actually examines what it claims to examine.